Mr. Schmidt, this is your extraordinary reporting, extraordinary series of interviews with John Kelly. What was your reaction to hearing Donald Trump's chief of staff say all of what we just heard and more? How'd you feel?
I don't know what my reaction really was to it. I think that it was our job to try and find a new way to tell this story. And I think a lot of the stories about Kelly have been out there and they've been written about and they've gotten a lot of attention in the print press. But I thought that the story would reach people differently if they could hear it. And I think that in the midst of any story, when you're trying to find different ways to communicate it to people and to, illuminate things and explain them, we have, because of, modern technology and such, different tools to do that and different ways to write stories and different ways to tell stories. And I thought in this case, it was really important to get Kelly to answer the questions in a way that people could hear from him, because I think that's one, it's more compelling. And two, it gives people more texture and insight into what this individual who spent more time behind closed doors with Donald Trump in the White House than any other senior official in his administration. So I think this story is as much about what Kelly said as it is the fact of how he is saying it in a way that you can actually hear him. And I think that's what makes a difference.
How, but also why now? What was the trigger? Because he worked to carry out Trump's agenda for over a year. He saw Trump's conduct, and we've heard from John Kelly a number of times over the last 3 years. Why was this particular moment so different for him?
I think that Kelly decided that he would speak out under two different circumstances. One, if Trump said something about him or related to him that was wildly inaccurate, or if Trump said something that he thought was really dangerous or offensive or damaging to the country. And he saw what Trump said about using the military on American citizens. And that is a real red line for Kelly. I think Kelly sees the divide between the military and the American people and civilians and the American military being used in the United States as hugely important, hugely consequential. And that same tension is inside of him when he's deciding whether to speak, because he still sees himself as a uniformed military officer, albeit a retired one. So the tension in him is that he doesn't want himself to get involved in politics. He doesn't want to be involved in partisan politics. He hates partisan politics. At the same side of the other side of the coin, he also thinks that using the American military domestically is a really, really troubling, terrible prospect. And I think that he thought that using that rhetoric, particularly in a presidential campaign by a former president about what he would do if he was back in office, was so troubling that he felt a need to speak out.
Mr. Steele, John Kelly is a highly decorated retired Marine Corps general. He told the New York Times that he actually agrees with some of Donald Trump's policies, but fitness of character should matter more. Do you think Republican voters are going to listen to anything he has to say here?
I think some will. The reality of it is I agree with some of his policies is a throwaway at this point. You're just like, okay, yeah, well, so what? At the end of the day, it's about everything else because we haven't talked about policies in how long? So it's not that. It really is about the fitness of character, the readiness and steadiness to do the job, the seriousness with which one is required to do the job, to be president. Donald Trump exhibits none of that. And it is profoundly important that someone like General Kelly right now comes out and speaks to that. Yep, the trigger was, that the president wants to turn on the American people. Well, we've known that for a while. I mean, this is not a new revelation in that sense. We've seen examples of it. I mean, just weeks ago, we were talking about, the president, layering up or, playing, Haitians as eating cats and dogs when he knew that was a lie. But the fact of the matter is everyone finds their trigger. And it'll be interesting to see if others are triggered in the next couple of weeks to say this and more about the man they once served, because that's probably, at the end of the day, Stephanie, the biggest missing piece. The work that Michael's done here is good, important, dogged journalism to get someone who has largely been reticent, very much been quiet at times when you really need him to speak up, to now speak up. And so, that's it. That's what's important about this moment more than anything else for me.
Gabe, looking at our country right now, is it realistic to think that voters will consider character and fitness? I don't even want to say over issues, because it's not, when we talk to voters, it's not like they're excited about where Donald Trump stands on issues. And they don't say character or fitness, but they like his person. I can't even believe I'm saying this, but they're drawn to his personality.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, this is a version of the same conversation we've all been having since 2015. I know we say that a lot, but in a case like this, when you do hear from someone as senior as his former chief of staff and someone who is, of course, very widely respected in military circles, it does speak at a different level to voters, or at least that's the idea. It's certainly what the Harris campaign is hoping. I don't know if they're planning. I don't know what they're planning in terms of elevating these stories, but there's no doubt that when you look at this all from a purely electoral perspective in the home stretch of an election here, you do see Kamala Harris and Democrats more broadly going after voters who voted for Nikki Haley in the Republican primary. And those are the people who aren't always won over by the Democratic side, but do say things like, I'm not so sure about Trump's character. Over the last few weeks, you've seen Harris in particular talk about January 6th in particular as a way of reminding those voters of the chaos around Trump. But in many cases, what you do hear from voters is, listen, I know all I need to know about Trump to render a judgment about his character. And so when you do have people talking about how to trigger people to vote differently around an issue like this question, what a lot of Democrats have been saying is essentially there's this weird nostalgia around Trump about this vague idea that things were better. So what they're trying to do is highlight specific ways that he was a chaotic president, that life was chaos under him, not just the government, but for everyday people. So things like this do speak to the character question, but there's a larger, again, if we're just talking in electoral terms, larger question about how much this is really going to move voters. Obviously, they do believe, Democrats do believe, even many Republicans do believe, there are some voters out there who are going to see things like this from people like Kelly, who have not spoken in terms like this and in media like this, as Michael said, in audio, on television. They might reach a new audience. And that is, of course, that remains to be seen. We have 2 weeks to find out.
I don't know. In 2016, people didn't know Donald Trump. They wanted something new. They wanted something different. And as new and jaw-dropping as Michael Schmidt's reporting is tonight, absolutely none of us are surprised. Michael, let's also talk about this Atlantic reporting that Donald Trump allegedly said he wanted the kind of generals that Adolf Hitler had. A Trump spokesperson has denied this. But John Kelly talked to you about how Trump openly admired dictators. What do you make of all of this? Shocking, or is it?
Well, look, Trump has been very open about his admiration for dictators. He has, talked about it publicly. His public behavior has shown that. His diplomacy and his foreign policy showed that. His meetings with the leader of North Korea time and time again showed all of that. I think the stuff that Kelly talked to us about Hitler was the idea that Trump said to him, Hitler did do some good things, and how Kelly basically had to explain to Trump why saying that was so problematic, why everything that Hitler did was as part of his racist efforts to do the worst things in humanity, and how anything that Hitler did could never be looked at as good because of that. And the thing that I found most interesting about it was that Trump would stop talking about it. It would end the conversation, but Trump would still bring it up at other times. So it wasn't like this just came up once and Kelly provided him with an explanation and Trump sort of learned, wow, I shouldn't say that. He brought it up again and again to Kelly. It wasn't something that just came up once. It came up multiple times, despite Kelly explaining to him the problems with it.
Mr. Steele, NPR went back to when Donald Trump began preparing for this campaign in 2022 and found that he has made more than 100 threats to investigate, prosecute, imprison, or otherwise punish his enemies. How concerned are you that this is now the trend in American politics and it will outlive Donald Trump's political career?
Oh, damned concerned. And this door has been opened. This is a Pandora's box now for this country. You have people on the right who firmly believe in exactly that outcome, that they want to use political power and the institutions of power to weaponize it against the American people if they don't like their politics, they don't like their policy, they don't like the position that they have on, that are different from theirs. So, yeah, this is a door that's now been opened. It's not just Donald Trump. And I think that is something that is going to be very concerning for the American people, which is why I've been stressing so much in this cycle and in prior cycles. It matters who you elect, folks. Pay attention to the words coming out of their mouths. Those don't be entertained by them. You can be in a situation where someone could be really nice and sweet and you say all these nice cuddly things and then cut your throat. That's what this is like. It is that nebulous and serious at the same time, because you just don't know who or what or when these folks will unleash that kind of power. And the fact that, you have so many right now in my party who stand in allegiance with Trump, looking to be the heir apparent to Trump, wanting to promote a better, more dressed up, more sophisticated style of Trumpism, the underlying rot is the same. The underlying curse against the Constitution is the same. So, yeah, it's a problem.